40,000 years ago, in the cold valleys of Ice Age Europe, smoke drifted from the mouth of a cave. Inside, a small group gathered around a fire. Someone with a healed, twisted limb sat among them. Alive because others had carried him, fed him, kept him warm through winters that could kill in a single night. These people buried their dead. They shaped stone with careful hands. They marked their world with pigment and memory. They were the Neanderthals, and for thousands of years, they shared this planet with us. Then they were gone. The deeper science looks, the less simple their story becomes. The world that made the Neanderthals was not a gentle one. Around 400,000 years ago, in the forests and frozen plains of Ice Age Europe, a people took shape unlike anything that had existed before. They were stocky and powerful, built low to the ground, with short limbs designed to hold heat in a body that burned enormous energy just to exist. Their brow ridges swept heavily above deep-set eyes. Their noses were wide and projecting, almost architectural. A biological furnace that warmed Arctic air before it could damage the lungs. The Neanderthals were significantly stronger than modern humans, on average. Some biomechanical models even suggest certain Neanderthal individuals could match or exceed elite modern athletes in pulling or gripping strength. Every feature was an answer to a question posed by the cold. But there is one detail that tends to stop people. The Neanderthal brain, on average, was larger than ours, by a lot. The largest Neanderthal skull ever found, from a specimen known as a Mood-1, held a brain of 1,736 cubic centimeters. That is one of the biggest brains ever recorded in any human being. We do not know what they did with all that neural real estate. We may never know. But the image of the dull-eyed brute shambling through the dark, that image belongs to a story we told ourselves before we knew better. It was never true. To understand who the Neanderthals were, you have to stand in front of what they hunted. Imagine a woolly mammoth, 4 meters at the shoulder, 6 tons of muscle and ivory, capable of killing with a sweep of its tusk. Now, imagine coordinating a group of 8 or 10 people armed with wooden spears and hand-knapped stone points, in snow, in near silence, trying to bring one down. That is what Neanderthals did, routinely. Their stone tool tradition, known as the Mousterian, was built on a technique called l'évaluat. A toolmaker would shape a stone core over many stages, each blow removing material in a precise sequence, until a single final strike could produce a perfectly formed flake, sharp, symmetrical, ready to cut. It required planning across time. It required holding a finished shape in the mind before it existed in the stone. That is not instinct. That is craft. And the evidence of what they did with those tools is staggering. At a site in Germany called Neumark Nord, researchers found the remains of over 70 straight-tusked elephants, animals that could weigh up to 13 metric tons, bearing cut marks consistent with systematic Neanderthal butchery. At Linford in England, 41 hand axes were found alongside the bones of at least 7 woolly mammoths. One hand axe was discovered pressed against a mammoth skull. In northern Italy, a stone point was recovered embedded in a mammoth skeleton, its tip fractured from the force of impact with bone. These are not the traces of scavengers. This is the archaeology of people who looked at the largest animals on Earth and decided to hunt them, who coordinated, planned, and struck. There is something almost incomprehensible about that, something that deserves more than a footnote in a natural history documentary. Something that deserves wonder. But here is where the story takes a stranger turn, because alongside the bones and the blades, the Neanderthals left something harder to explain. Red ochre, iron-rich pigment, ground into powder or shaped into crayon-like pieces, appears at Neanderthal sites tens of thousands of years before modern humans arrived in Europe. Eagle talons bearing careful cut marks, suggesting the feathers or claws were deliberately removed. Shells carried from distant coastlines, perforated animal teeth that may have been strung and worn. At sites in Spain, researchers have found cave art, geometric shapes, hand stencils, red and black markings on cave walls, dated to over 65,000 years ago. Modern humans had not yet reached Europe. The only people there were Neanderthals. We cannot say with certainty what any of it meant to them. That is the honest answer. We do not know if they had language in the way we do, or ritual, or anything resembling what we would call religion. But we know they were doing something with color and shape and symbol that was not purely practical. They were reaching toward something beyond the immediate, something invisible. That impulse to mark, to decorate, to make meaning, we have always thought of as ours. Perhaps it is older than we imagined. Of all the Neanderthal individuals ever found, one tells the most human story. He was excavated at Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan in 1957. Researchers named him Shanidar 1. The team on the dig called him Nandi. By the time he died, somewhere between 35 and 50 years old, which was genuinely old for the Pleistocene. His body had accumulated damage that is almost painful to read through. A severe trauma to the left side of his face, likely from early in his life, had probably destroyed vision in that eye. His right arm had been amputated at the elbow, whether from injury or something more deliberate is unknown, and had healed to a smooth stump. His right leg bore healed fractures and showed abnormal bowing that would have affected how he walked. His spine showed signs of degenerative disease, and new analysis of his ear canals published in recent years revealed dense bony growths consistent with profound hearing loss. Deaf, partially blind, one-armed, in pain, living on a steppe where physical ability was the difference between eating and not eating, between warmth and cold, between life and death. He survived to middle age. There is only one way that happens. The people around him chose to keep him alive. They fed him, they sheltered him, they accommodated his limitations, possibly for years. The researchers who have studied Shanidar 1 most closely have reached the same quiet conclusion. He was cared for deliberately by his community. We do not know what word they had for what they felt. We do not know if there was ceremony or tenderness or simply habit, but we know the outcome. They did not leave him behind. That is, by any reasonable measure, compassion. And compassion. The choice to sustain someone who cannot fully sustain themselves is one of the rarest and most profound things in the natural world. It is the kind of thing we like to think makes us human. The Neanderthals were doing it 50,000 years before any of us existed. And then, without drama, they were gone. The last confirmed Neanderthal fossils date to around 40,000 years ago, possibly with isolated pockets lingering slightly later in southern Iberia or the Caucasus. Within a few thousand years of modern humans spreading into Europe, the same modern humans who would eventually become us, the Neanderthals simply ceased to appear in the record. No massacre, no single catastrophe, just a slow diminishment, a narrowing of range, a thinning of numbers, until the line went quiet. We know modern humans and Neanderthals met. We know they interbred. Today, if your ancestry traces outside sub-Saharan Africa, roughly 1 to 2% of your genome is Neanderthal. That fraction is not decorative. Neanderthal gene variants have been linked to immune responses, bone density and metabolism. A biological inheritance from people who spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to a world our ancestors never knew. We carry them inside us. That is not a metaphor, that is genomics. But it also raises a question that science cannot fully answer. Did we absorb them, or did we replace them? The truth is probably somewhere between the two, and somewhere in that space is a story we may never be able to tell completely. In 1856, workers clearing a limestone cave in Germany's Neander Valley found bones that didn't look quite right. The skull was too thick, the brow too heavy. The scientists who examined them reached for easy explanations. A diseased modern human, a deformed soldier, a primitive brute from an earlier age. It took more than a century to understand what they had actually found. A people who hunted mammoths in coordinated groups, who made tools of real sophistication, who painted caves and wore ornaments, who buried their dead and cared for those who could not care for themselves, who endured for 300,000 years across some of the most hostile landscapes this planet has ever produced. They were not a failed version of us. They were not a rough draft. They were a fully realized answer to the question of how to be human. Different from our answer, shaped by a different world, and in some ways more demanding than anything we have ever faced. The mystery of the Neanderthals is not where they went. The mystery is how completely we underestimated them for so long, and how much, even now, we may still be missing. Somewhere in their caves, in the flicker of whatever light they used, something looked out at the same stars we look at now. Something wondered, perhaps, what was out there in the dark. We will never know what they thought, but we know they were there. And that in itself is extraordinary.